Hey, good morning, Isaac.
Rabbi, good morning. It's a new day. Looking forward to a discussion today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're in the middle of the conversation that the devil and Jesus are having. And I
Mhm.
guess that's not a sentence we could say very often. Devil and Jesus walk into a bar. What conversation do they
Yeah.
have?
Now, in the Bible, right, there are only a few instances when a conversation between God and the devil takes place, as in one of the book of Job, right, and that's
Right.
one place. And then this could be a second instance where the devil and God and Jesus being God having a conversation.
Yeah, well, even that whole ideology of angelology is
Hmm.
an evolving concept throughout the Bible. When we talk about different time periods, it's very clear that they have different ideologies around angelology.
Hmm.
So I think it would be very foreign at different time periods to talk about angels and God, because it's very easy to think of when you think of the unity of God and monotheism to imagine that there's no other angels floating around. It's God leads, and God doesn't need interceders or intermediaries. It's very interesting in the opening verses of the Bible where it uses God's name. I don't know if you recognize it. It uses God's name as a plural. It says the tetragrammaton is a singular, the Jehovah, but the name of Elohim, the one that judges, is a plural word. So one of the when it says it's weird that it talks about God in plural, but one of the phrases that says "Let us make man."
Let us make man in our image. Yeah.
So generally, rabbinic ideology states that that means that God consulted with the angels. So I think at different time periods, there would have been different attitudes towards God, either having a conversation with a divine court, and or interacting with
Yeah.
angelic beings. The whole idea of a devil, I think, a lot of times, especially what we see in modern movies and comics and other things, it seems like there's this fake battle that's going on between God and the devil. And the
Hmm.
devil is always trying to override or take power, but it's always
Hmm.
like this vain battle that can never win. In rabbinic literature and I guess in the Bible, we don't see the devil acting that way. We see him kind of acting out God's will. It seems if you had to guess right now, you would say God wants Jesus to be tested, and therefore he sends the devil, right? No, I'm all ears. How do you interpret the
Well, I mean, I
ending of the
think
devil?
so. Firstly, thank you for this thing about let us make man. Probably Christians look at this as concept of the Trinity and how God is one and three. So, to your point, right? Like, did
You can fill
God?
in that sentence however you want. Uh, ABC, the Christians view this as the way
Did,
that the
did-
Trinity plays out.
yeah. Anyway,
The variable in the beginning is just a variable.
yeah. So, to your question about like, did God want Jesus to be tested by the devil, right? I mean, so suffering, temptation, being tempted. This is a part of life. This is just life. I mean, I sometimes feel hard pressed to say that God tempted him this person. I mean, that's a human way to understand this thing, but is it really so, or is it just an aspect of life where people are tempted? It's not like God. I mean, I don't know. That's my way of looking at
Well, I
it.
think this is how we get the Zoroastrian dualist attitude and where Gnostics come from. When dualists and Gnostics start having attitudes towards understanding philosophy and the theology of religions, they say, "Can God do evil?" So, for example, in mystical traditions, a lot of times they'll say it's not that God does evil, is that He limits His exposure to the world, and then evil has a place for that.
I
But I
think
think
that's
that's
what.
like
Yeah.
more a geographic question than a theological question about how it takes place. I think you're stuck. Listen, the devil exists
Yeah.
no matter what you say as a permission from God, right?
Yeah.
At the very minimum. So, if I give permission to the destroyer to destroy, but I'm not actually destroying, would anyone feel that I'm not the one who's really pulling the strings?
Yeah, but then he's also given for Christian theology, right? He's also given people the framework or a way to
100%.
I mean, it's not like the devil can just come destroy people's life. I mean,
Right. He's
like
completely limited
yeah,
in
class.
the limitations that God sets for
Yeah,
him.
yeah.
It's actually interesting. I think when certain things bad happen for a long time, a period in rabbinic tradition, there's this idea that once I guess like nature is let loose, that you just let that God kind of brought back his presence, and that we say that the world, he's letting the world act how it wants. The world could go crazy. And I think that this is one of the ways that, at least in Jewish tradition, that you justify horrors. You say once that permission was given, permission wasn't only given for that thing, but permission was given to go buck wild and go and destroy and however you want. Okay.
That's a whole
Anyway,
different conversation. So let's come back to to four four today.
yeah, 4-4.
Yeah, the Gospel according to St. Matthew, chapter 4, verse 4. But he answered, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God.
Right. We looked at this verse yesterday at the end of fourth
Yeah.
period, and there's different ways to dissect this. Yesterday, you suggested the conversation point of, would Christians have known this verse? So
Like at this point, Jesus is a Jew, right? So within Judaism, like would Judaism have known this verse? I mean, wouldn't that be the question? Because at this
would
point,
Jews know Deuteronomy
Deuteronomy, that's right.
8:3
That's
by
right.
heart? Okay, so I figured in order to understand this, let's first look at Deuteronomy 8:3. Let's see what some traditions say about that verse. I found some traditions on it, and then let's try to see how it gets changed a little bit in the Greek, and a little bit how the verse is bisected. It's only half of it is cited, and then let's try to figure out what it is that Jesus wants us to see in this verse. So I figured that a little, like, I know we usually don't have a plan,
No, thank
but
you. This is really great. It's always something I wondered. Like of all the verses in the Old Testament, is there something about this verse? Christians say that something in the book of Deuteronomy because all three verses are from Deuteronomy. He memorized the whole chapter, but I go, well, it's a big chapter for people to memorize.
again,
Anyway,
I see no problem to say that Jesus knew the whole Old Testament, the whole Pentateuch by heart. I would see no, and I think a lot of times that us as moderns have problems imagining, because you have too much Netflix in your life.
I don't have any Netflix.
I'm saying you
I know. So
everyone.
is it typical for Jewish, within the Jewish world, for folks to have this command of the scriptures, as in so he wasn't just quoting something, he truly believed in this, he had memorized
Yeah,
this to a
and I
point
think
where
preachers and rabbis would believe in it and know it by heart. Like myself, I only know a limited about stuff by heart because, again, I think the modern
yeah,
rabbi has different attitudes. But I pointed out my wife's great grandma. But
yeah.
I'll also say that this is going to sound even crazier, right? For this, my wife's grandfather, the way that he got married, I'm sure there's other things involved, is that they took a pin and they put it in top of a book and they stuck it to the book, and he had to say every word that was hitting through the book. And
Wow.
that was in a Talmud book. And the idea is that if you don't know the Talmud by heart, why are you a rabbi? It's not even something to talk about. You know the Talmud by heart, and then we could start talking about other things that you know or don't know. So I think, again, the reason that you would even assume or have the hypothesis that Jesus doesn't know all this by heart is, I think, a modern attitude.
So so at this point he's 30 years old. So you're saying by the age of 30, right, the person has learned
By
the
the age
script,
of 15, yeah.
that they have this command of this command of the scriptures, and to
Obviously, there's different levels of knowledge and different levels of memory, but the people who generally became preachers and higher level knowledge, it's absolutely not out of question that he would have known 1,000 verses by heart, 500 verses by heart. But to say that he knew 5,000 also would not been out of whack.
wow.
These things are just not, they're not even impressive, especially if you go to a madrasa, a Muslim school, and see how they train kids today. It's absolutely not out of whack or uncommon to find certain kids that know the whole Quran by the time they're 15. It's not common, but it's not like you wouldn't say, oh, a miracle happened here. Certain kids memorize the whole Quran because their whole education, I don't know if you watch a couple YouTube videos on it, a lot of times the education will be the teacher says the verse, the kid repeats the verse, the teacher says the verse, and that's an education for a decade. That's how they learn, because I think the idea is that kids' brains don't really work well yet in order to analyze data. So it's better to make them memorize data so that when their brains eventually start to work, once they hit the teens, then they'll be able to analyze the data properly. So the actual verse in Deuteronomy 8:3, I'm going to read it in English, but I'll give you one more precursor for it. One of the things that I believe about Matthew is that if we only read the verse, you're missing the point. Almost all the verses that we've had, especially the Old Testament prophecy fulfillments, I believe that you're also supposed to read the context of the verse. So, for example, when it says that you'll be my son, my only son in Exodus, I think when you read the whole section around that makes sense, and that's true for almost all of these. And I think over here, I'm gonna read you 8:3, but when I read you 8:2, you're gonna be like, "Wow, of course." I'll read you 8:3 first, then hopefully I'll surprise you with 8:2. So now 8:3, he afflicted you, namely God afflicted the Israelites in the desert, and let you hunger, namely unclear how hungry they were. They had quail, they had other animals, but there was some form of hunger that they needed manna. Then he fed you manna that you did not know, namely the manna was something from heaven that you didn't have experience with, nor did your forefathers know, meaning that God never gave it to anyone before that, in order to make known to you that not by bread alone does man live, rather by everything that emanates from the mouth of God does man live. So first of all, when Moses said this, when the first Jews, Israelites were reading this would have been confusing, because when they got the manna, there's no doubt that they were supposed to believe in God and say thank you God, and they got double portion on Friday. But this is a homiletic. This is a preaching right here. That, by the way, you know why you got the manna? Not because you're hungry. I could have fed you a million ways. You got this in order to teach you a lesson. So I don't think this is like obvious in Exodus. I think this is a very Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomy's perspective of why manna was chosen as opposed to more quail, as opposed to, they left with tons of animals from Egypt, gold, silver animals. Why didn't they eat those things? Why didn't they just go to a farmland? Let's be honest. You could get from Egypt to the land of Israel in 2 weeks if you walk straight, or 3 weeks, whatever. The fact they spent 40 years, all these things made the food unnecessary. It was because they was chosen to access food that way. So I think that the idea that Deuteronomy is giving you a different attitude, that the food was given by God in order to teach you a lesson. And this is definitely what Jesus is citing. But before we go on, let me read you 8:2. You should remember the entire road in which God, your God, led you these 40 years in the wilderness, so to afflict you, to test you, to know what is in your heart, whether you would observe his commandments or not. Is anyone in their right mind reads 8:3 in Deuteronomy for Matthew without reading 8:2? There's no way they can get the point, right? When we read 8:2, you probably in your head, you're like, oh my God, for 40 years to test. Every single thing that Jesus is going through is in 8:2, and then we read 8:3. So before, let me soak it up. What do you say about that? Number one.
So, wow. So it sounds like he wasn't quoting a verse as much. He was quoting a common truth, a truth in Deuteronomy
Well, he's
that
definitely
God
quoting a verse, but the verse has a context.
has a context. And so I can see why this verse stands out, right? I said, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word which proceeds from the mouth of God. So with that context, but to make sense of that, when I read in the chapter, when we read verse 2, right, how 40 years they wandered, they wandered there, and as you mentioned, the hunger was more as a means for them to it was more as an epistemological vehicle to access a deeper truth, and that deeper truth being that God cares for you, and that your needs are met. And
Right.
so in that context, it's hard. Yeah, so there are parallels between 2:3 and what's happening in Matthew 4, right? Like they were for 40 years and their 40 days, and here they were hungry, and they had this hunger too. And here again, it's manna from heaven, and it's still bread, and there's stones into bread. But now, so it feels like in this case, right? Again, I haven't read 8 completely. Sounds like in this context that the Israelites failed to pass the test, or it took them a while before they understand.
This is Deuteronomy has a lot of rebuke and a lot of this is what happen if you do this, then this will happen. So, for example, Rashi, the famous medieval commentator from the 12th century, he says from on 8:2, the verse says whether you will observe the commandments, and he says, so God is not forced to test you. That's literally the comment that he makes on it. That if you don't observe commandments, then God will test you. And if you do observe commandments, then God will not test you. So Rashi is 1,000 years after Jesus, but it's interesting that he sees the whole idea of testing is because you only get tested because you're failing. And it's interesting. There's no doubt that's not how the New Testament is using it. There's no doubt that testing is meant to be an idea that in order to help you grow. But it's interesting how we even have these two ideas of testing. One, testing, because if you fail the test, if you fail, I give you a retest in order to make sure you learn information now. That's one reason for a test. Another reason for a test is because I want to test you the first time to make sure you already have the information. You're able to grow. I want to make sure you had that level. Another interesting thing that I found on this is totally, I guess, sidebar, that there's a Babylonian Talmud that's the most important rabbinic writings for the oral laws, and there's a Talmud text on this verse of 8:3, and it's from Rabbi Eliezer, who is a 1st and 2nd century rabbi, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. and independent, his comments is really interesting. He just compares his verse to a chapter from Psalms, but his idea, he's saying, because we're tested we were given this for 40 years, we will have 40 years of the messianic era. So it's a long. I don't want to go into like why he's getting there, but what he saw in 8:2 was a messianic verse. And that's what I think is really interesting, that it seems, at least from Eliezer, a first and second century rabbi, that he saw a messianic verse in 8:2 and 8:3. And I think that
I'm surprised the Messianic years only for 40 years. It's the Messianic years forever, kingdom forever and ever. I mean, it has no end.
To each his own, right? There's I don't know if you want to say that maybe the Messiah, it's only messianic years when the Messiah is alive, then maybe the messianic years are only 30 years according, or 35 according to Jesus. I don't know. I think there's lots of different ways to look at what messianic years means. And again, like, put that aside, that's one opinion of a million opinions. But I think it just shows that this verse had a messianic background. Okay, so now we're at what does Jesus cite and what does he not cite, and what has changed in the Greek? Because there is one word that's changed in the Greek. So he cuts off the first half of the verse, right? He only brings
Okay, so
one does live by bread alone, but not by every
can I
word
just
that comes from
okay?
God.
Can I ask a quick question? So the temptation was convert stones into bread. And we saw yesterday how if he did this, he's damned. If he said, no, you can't even do this, it's like neither this
Damned
nor
if I
no.
do, damned if I don't.
Okay, so how, like, what is the purpose in quoting this verse then? Like, how does this verse even address that temptation? What is, so given the context we discussed, right, in Deuteronomy 8, 2 and 3, where it's less about bread.
You're asking the question, right? That's the question that
That's
we have to answer. Why is Jesus quoting this verse? That's
or how, and how does this verse, I mean, well, we know why he quotes this verse, like this verse would have been common for them. No, but how does this verse answer, like, what is the connection between this verse and the temptation put forth, or the question put forth by the devil, right?
That's the question. That's literally our question.
Okay, fine.
That you're summarized. That's the question. So, just to repeat, in Deuteronomy, it starts with "He afflicted you and let you hunger." So that context that was cut off, that's literally that beginning of verse, is exactly what's happening to Jesus. He afflicted you, namely by not by whatever reason he's not eating. Let's just say that's the affliction, and then he made you hungry because you're not eating, and then he fed you manna. So that didn't necessarily happen. It's interesting. So what is happening there? In order to make you know that not by bread alone does man live, rather by everything that emanates from God's mouth. So the one thing that was changed, as you can see, is that instead of saying everything, it says every word. I personally don't see a big difference between those two. Some people make a big deal about that. I think that's what emanates from your mouth, words. So let's go to your question now. To understand your question, I think we have to do one more. I kept saying yesterday that Jesus has a genre, right? Miracle worker. And miracle worker is a first century genre. But as I mentioned, Jesus actually hits around 10 genres, for better or worse. Why wouldn't a Messiah hit so many genres? So another genre that exists is a thing called a sophist. Have you ever heard the word sophist before?
No.
Okay. A sophist is people generally who made it their living off of giving good speeches and kind of finagling words. I know the word, like twisting words into making them. So it's a 5th century BCE movement from Athens, but there is a world of sophists existing in the 1st century alone. Whatever they did, for most part, they never answered a question straightforward. Because when you answer a question straightforward, it's almost viewed as a level of hubris, of egoism, that you have divine knowledge. If I answer you, I am the man who could give you the answers. And again, like, that's one of the problems in our world today. Like, people like, you want the answer, here's the answer. But maybe the answer is multifarious. Maybe the answer is varied and it's differentiated. So they generally had a really great understanding of words and how to change the meaning of words. And they would be able to use that to both entertain, to impress, and to persuade people. So I view this verse as Jesus taking off the miracle worker hat. He could have done miracles. We all know it would have been no problem for him to do miracles from the rest of the New Testament, right? But he took the hat off because he was put on a spot, and it would have been egoism or hubris for him to do that, for various reasons, and he puts on the sophist hat. And the sophist hat is saying that the thing that you're trying to make me accomplish, I'm going to turn it and make you try understand your question from a different perspective. And I think that is exactly what the sophist hat. Again, you could Google or
It's
Wikipedia.
so funny you should mention, you should talk about hats. I'm reading this book. It's called The Six Thinking Hats.
Oh wow!
It's different ways of thinking. It's just how to think, and it's wow. So well, that makes
Right, and when you answer a question, it's so important. Like I took a class on Maimonides once, and well, multiple times actually. But one of the things that the teacher started, he goes, if you want to understand Maimonides, you have to understand number one, Jewish culture in the 13th and 14th century. Number two, you have to understand medieval Arabic philosophy. Number three, you have to understand Neoplatonism. Number four, you have to understand Jewish philosophy. Number five, you have to understand Jewish law. And he went on, and you could understand any of his writings from any of those perspectives. How could this writing be a product of 13th and 14th century Egypt? How could this writing be a legalistic writing? And I think this is what, when we look at Jesus, we always have to look at these hats as well. I don't know if it's 6 hats or many. I'm sure someone made a list of all the different hats that Jesus wore. I'm sure it wasn't only a beautiful kippah. So over here, I think that
so okay. So
yeah.
you're saying thank you for this observation, right? So he took off the hat of a miracle worker,
which
and
he was accused of being,
accused of being, or that was a question to prove that he is a miracle worker,
that he's a son of God,
son of God.
Yes.
And so now he's taken on this different hat or this different way of seeing. Now, is this hat, right? So we discussed that prophets, miracle worker, these were special. Like not everyone could be a prophet. Not everyone could be a miracle worker.
The hardest thing in the world is being a sophist.
Oh, okay. So
I think it's easier to be a miracle worker than a sophist.
Okay, why? Okay, so is being a sophist, right? Is that divinely given, or is it a human skill? Or
I don't have an answer to that. A sophist is a person who is an expert in language, a person who could twist words.
Would Rabbi Sachs qualify to be a sophist?
So sophist usually has a negative connotation.
I see. Okay.
Yes, from the perspective that Rabbi Sachs and Martin Luther King and others can use language in such a dexterous way that the adroitness of their language is such a different level that, yeah, I would say that they're able to take words and use it in a different way. If that makes sense. Okay, so now I'm arguing that we should take off the miracle hat and put on Jesus of the sophist hat. So what would that mean here, right? So before I tell you what I think, how do you understand his answer?
So which means, based on what you discussed, so for a sophist means he's not going to answer this at the level of the argument, but he's going to twist it. He's going to answer this at a different level.
He's
right?
going to use his own truths or his own rationality in order to give like a deeper religious truth to the devil that maybe the devil didn't even understand. Right?
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, right? So he didn't answer at the level of the question. He didn't answer this at the level of the questions.
Didn't even think to do that. There's no stammering. It's not wait a second. Literally, devil in, Jesus out. Like immediately, it happens. So yeah, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's so he changes just to say, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. I still don't know how. I'm still not tracking what's changed in this answer, or what is that he's changed in this answer, which takes the question to a deeper level. I mean, apart from saying that, he's not saying men don't have to eat at all. That's not what he's saying, because people do have to eat. It's not like people can just fast all the times and God will somehow make them alive. We have physical bodies. We have to nourish them to be alive. I'm not able to connect the dots between the question and in what way is his reply a deeper. It's a deeper version of the question.
It's so crazy. Even when we think forward, let's imagine just for a second, it's not true. Let's imagine that turning something into bread is bad. We have in Matthew 14 and 15, he literally does this. It's almost like, by the way, Matthew 14 and 15, chapters, you could go back and you could say, I could have done this with my eyes closed. It's almost like a shtuck. Like Jesus is like, you know what, devil? Go, you know the future. You could be atemporal. I'm gonna do this no problem anyways. It's almost more ironic. The fact that he turns something into bread or makes bread out of nothing or out of stone, however you want to see it, happening in the future in order to feed people, it's almost like ironic that he's doing that. So some people want to, the medieval commentators, I think, want to see that Jesus is being tested by gluttony or his attitude towards food. But I view food as a metaphor for the physical world, the thing that sustains us. And for me, as I mentioned yesterday, I think he was trying to say, if you're hungry, Jesus, as we see in verse 4:2, if you're feeling that you need to feel connected to the physical world, that is my goal as a devil. I want you to feel hungry. I want you to feel that you need to chase all the 7 sins. I need you to chase whatever, everything bound in the world, because the more that I could test you and pull you away from your divine mission, that's the more meaningful. So if he did either miracle program, that would have been a negative. So what he does is he says that I think the great his ability to fulfill John the Baptist's sophist ability. Also, sophists are also people who go to deserts and live by themselves. Anyways, so he was able to say that it was never about being able to do miracles. It's always about attitude. And my attitude is that food and any of the 7 sins or any of the different sins one could do, all these things are really just to serve God. And if you think that I'm able to make food to make myself feel that I'm not going to be hungry anymore, or to not turn to food in order to make me question the fact that I'm son of God, I reject both. I am going to the next level and say the only purpose of food is to serve God. And I can prove it to you. In the desert, in this one verse in Deuteronomy, they take the idea that happens in Exodus and they almost revolutionize it. They say it's not about the fact that they got food. It's not about the fact that God gave them food. It's not the fact that they were sustained 40 years. They could have been sustained a million other ways. The reason that they had food is only so they could recognize a divine truth about God. And that's the thing that Jesus is replying to the devil.
Okay,
I recognize the
okay,
only purpose of food
yeah.
is to teach me the divine truth as proven by 8:3 in Deuteronomy. And therefore, it's not about me getting food or not getting food. It's about me recognize that food is itself a metaphor for God giving us sustenance and God controlling the world. And therefore, me as Jesus, I'm tapping into that divine reality. And therefore, the devil, your temptation on both sides is a failure.
I see. That's. Thank you. Well, thank you for sharing that. I need to think more deeply about it. So you're saying that, okay, so it's less about the food. It's how the devil is trying to use food to take him away from his mission. But he's saying, no, I'm not going to let you
Test me and allow me to question my faith on either side of either by gluttony on the one side, or I don't want to call it gluttony because he hasn't eaten in 40 days, but on hunger on one side, on famished on one side, and the other side, a question if he's really the son of God. So he didn't buy into the question.
So okay, so what he's doing is he's questioned. He has taken on the question itself. Like rather than trying to respond to the question, he's saying that this question is completely irrelevant. Is that what he's done? Like he's saying,
I don't know if irrelevant. It misunderstands the attitude of Deuteronomy 8:3 that the food's purpose is in order to teach you a divine message. And it says the whole idea is like, when they're saying we don't live by food alone, it's by manna alone. They were living by manna alone. It's almost ironic. They said we don't live by manna or bread alone when they were living by manna and bread alone.
yeah. Now, the book of Deuteronomy, right? This was written by Moses, right? And so this is Moses trying to rehash, giving people a way to think through what happened in the book of Exodus. Is that
That's a good way to look at it. Yeah.
okay? And so this is so. If you were to say just in a very short sentence, as in this is God's truth, or this is His, earlier we said, right, so that that food or any of these cannot be used to question God's truth or His promise, or I forget the exact words you used. Like, what is that? If you were to distill, this is God's truth, and food cannot be used for that. What would that
The
be?
idea of food, again, I'm using food as a metaphor for the physical world, that which sustains us. The idea is that the food is, if it's meant to sustain us, it's very easy to look at it as a physical representation of the world. But the end of the verse of Deuteronomy 8:3 says very simply that the idea is that it's more important to see food as a way to make us believe in God. And that's how Deuteronomy is
So believe in God
something-
as in, okay. So if I can focus on believe in God as in like what believe in God, that God
so for
exists.
Jesus' purpose, the way I understand his answer to the devil is that I understand my place in history. I understand that the food is not the point. It's more important for me to live by the word of God. Again, I view this as very much a John the Baptist kind of, I am part of the kingdom of heaven, and therefore what you're trying to talk about is push me off from the king of heaven. So again, when I talk about belief of God, I feel like I'm going to get trapped into the question of what do we mean by kingdom of heaven? So whatever you mean by kingdom of heaven, I feel he's saying I'm already part of the kingdom of heaven. It's upon us, and therefore your questions of if am I the son of God, am I going to be gluttonous, are side points, and we have to focus on if I'm what sustains me really is the word of God. What sustains me is this attitude of kingdom of heaven.
That's a very profound truth. Would you say that this truth over here applies to both Judaism and Christianity?
I never say anything in the New Testament applies to Judaism. I don't know. Again, like I think we have such different attitudes of kingdom. First of all, as we mentioned, when we talk about kingdom of heaven, even in from a sapiential eschatology perspective versus an apocalyptic eschatology perspective, even when Christians talk about kingdom of heaven, it is no universal or ubiquitous understanding. So when Jews, we're supposed to live in a world that's directed by divine beer goggles, and we all recognize that. And there's a famous story from Rabbi Soloveitchik that Brisker, his family's from the city of Brisk, that when they saw a sunset, they saw 10,000 legalistic things happening. Like, oh, this sunset, like the most on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, that this sunset gives you purity, this sunset purifies your soul. But other people just see a sunset. So I think a lot of times if you have the divine beer goggles on, some people understand that the legalistic universe exists side by side, almost in like this multiverse, that we're in two multiverses at once and living them both at once. And I think a lot of times the evangelical Christians very easily feel this way about their own lives. They're like, you think you're living, but when I have my life led by Jesus, I'm not really living the same kind of lifestyle as you're having. I'm not living, it's not only lifestyle, it's like when I see a good action take place, I see the divine hand in it. You just see evolution in nature. And I think it's a very different kind of divine goggles. And I think Jesus had these goggles on, and therefore if he did or didn't pass the test, that would have been a failure. His sophist hat came on because the whole thing, he had to turn on its head the devil's test.
So is this a hat of wisdom and knowledge? The spirit that
The word sophistry means wisdom.
wisdom.
But again, it has negative connotations historically.
Okay. Okay. Well, this has been a great discussion. I need to think about this more deeply, but it's a great way to start my day. And Rabbi, thank you.
Okay. And God. Okay. Thank you.
Rabbi.